Red and blue lights slice through the dead of night. A respected attorney is pulled from her vehicle, hand slammed onto the cold hood, while a grinning officer pulls stolen cash from her trunk. It's the perfect frame job, designed to destroy her career and silence her forever. But as those steel handcuffs click shut, this dirty cop has no idea he just sealed his own fate. Because the terrified lawyer crying in his back seat? She's the bait in a massive FBI sting. To the rest of the city, the 44th precinct was a pillar of law and order, a concrete fortress keeping the escalating crime rates at bay. But to those who actually lived in the neighborhood, the precinct was something else entirely. A localized cartel, run by a man with a badge. Sergeant Wayne Cutler was a 20-year veteran of the force. Over 2 decades, he had cultivated a reputation as a tough, uncompromising cop who got results. Behind closed doors, however, Cutler had built a lucrative extortion ring. He and a small, fiercely loyal squad of officers skimmed from drug busts, shook down local business owners for protection, and silenced anyone who dared to speak up by planting narcotics or stolen goods on them. Cutler was untouchable. He knew the system, he knew the judges, and he knew exactly how to exploit the blind spots in the Internal Affairs Division. Then came Camille Dawson. Camille was a 34-year-old defense attorney and a rising star at the prestigious law firm of Albright and Associates. Brilliant, unyielding, and fiercely dedicated to her clients, Camille had built her career by tearing apart sloppy police work. She wasn't just good. She was a force of nature in the courtroom. Born and raised in the very neighborhoods Cutler terrorized, Camille understood the reality of the streets better than the prosecutors she faced every day. Their paths first crossed 2 years earlier, during the trial of a young man named Jamal Evans. Cutler had arrested Jamal for an armed robbery, presenting what looked like an open and shut case, complete with found evidence and a convenient anonymous tip. But Camille dug deeper. During a grueling cross-examination, she methodically dismantled Cutler's timeline, exposing inconsistencies in his arrest report and proving that Jamal was 3 miles away, working a shift at a diner during the robbery. She didn't just win an acquittal, she humiliated Sergeant Cutler in open court, painting him as either dangerously incompetent or intentionally malicious. Cutler never forgot the sting of that embarrassment. In his twisted worldview, Camille was an uppity obstacle who needed to be reminded of her place. But Camille wasn't just a nuisance to Cutler's pride. She was becoming a legitimate threat to his criminal enterprise. Over the next 2 years, Camille began quietly gathering complaints from clients who told eerily similar stories about Cutler and his squad, tales of missing cash during raids, planted evidence, and brutal intimidation tactics. Word reached Cutler through his network of informants that the high-powered black lawyer was sniffing around his precinct's arrest records, filing public information requests, and building a civil rights lawsuit that could expose his entire operation. Cutler decided that Camille Dawson had to be neutralized. She couldn't just be warned off. She needed to be destroyed professionally and personally. If a prominent lawyer was caught with undeniable evidence of a felony, she would be disbarred, disgraced, and sent to prison. No one would ever believe her claims of police corruption again. Cutler began to meticulously plan the frame job. He needed something airtight. Narcotics were too common. A smart lawyer could argue they were planted by a vindictive ex-client. No, Cutler needed something tied to a specific, high-profile crime. He chose a violent home invasion that had occurred in a wealthy suburb earlier that week. Over $100,000 in cash and high-end jewelry had been stolen. The real culprits were a crew Cutler occasionally protected in exchange for a cut, but the public didn't know that. Cutler acquired a velvet bag containing $50,000 in banded cash and a distinct, serialized diamond watch from the robbery. He locked it in the trunk of his squad car, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He just needed Camille alone, in her car, on his turf. He thought he was the ultimate predator, setting a trap for an unsuspecting prey. What Sergeant Wayne Cutler didn't know was that he was already walking into a much larger, far more sophisticated snare. It was a freezing Tuesday night in late November. The city streets were slick with freezing rain, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. Camille Dawson walked out of a high-end steakhouse downtown, pulling her wool coat tightly around her shoulders. She had just finished a celebratory dinner with Stephen Albright and a few other partners from her firm after securing a massive settlement in a corporate liability case. She climbed into her black sedan, turning up the heat and connecting her phone to the car's Bluetooth. As she pulled out of the parking garage and began the 40-minute drive back to her suburban home, she didn't notice the unmarked grey SUV that pulled out of an alleyway 3 blocks behind her. Inside the SUV, Sergeant Cutler gripped the steering wheel, a cold smirk playing on his lips. Beside him sat Officer Greg Jenkins, a younger cop who had fully bought into Cutler's corrupt ideology. "That's her," Cutler muttered, his eyes locked on the taillights of Camille's sedan. "Stay loose, Greg. We do this by the book until we don't. We wait until she crosses into the 44th's jurisdiction, under the underpass on Miller Street." No traffic cameras there. Camille drove carefully, the rhythmic thumping of her windshield wipers the only sound in the quiet car. As she crossed into the industrial district, the scenery shifted from glass skyscrapers to darkened warehouses and chain-link fences. It was an isolated stretch of road. Suddenly, the night exploded in a blinding array of red and blue lights. Camille glanced in her rearview mirror, her heart giving a brief, instinctual flutter. A marked patrol car, which Cutler had swapped into minutes earlier, was riding her bumper, its siren blaring a short, aggressive wail. Frowning, Camille slowed down and pulled her sedan over to the gravel shoulder, placing her hands firmly on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. She knew the drill. She was a black woman in a desolate area at night. She wasn't taking any chances, even as an attorney. Cutler approached the driver's side window, a heavy flashlight in his hand. He tapped the glass with the heavy metal casing, harder than necessary. Camille rolled the window down, the freezing rain blowing into the warm cabin. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Cutler demanded, shining the blinding beam directly into her eyes. Camille squinted, turning her head slightly. "Officer, could you please lower the light? I'm reaching into my purse for my wallet." Cutler lowered the beam just enough for Camille to see his face. Her stomach plummeted. She recognized him instantly. The broad shoulders, the scarred chin, the cold, dead eyes. Sergeant Wayne Cutler. "Well, well," Cutler said, feigning surprise with a theatrical wide-eyed expression. "If it isn't Counselor Dawson. Out a little late, aren't we?" "I was at a work dinner, Sergeant," Camille said, her voice steady, betraying none of the sudden spike of adrenaline in her veins. She handed over her documents. "Was I speeding?" "You swerved back there," Cutler lied smoothly, snatching the cards from her hand, crossed the double yellow. "And honestly, Camille, you're looking a little flushed. Have you been drinking tonight?" "I had 1 glass of wine 3 hours ago. I am perfectly sober," she replied sharply. Cutler leaned in closer, invading her space, sniffing the air theatrically. "I smell something else. Smells like marijuana. And maybe desperation." "That is absurd, and you know it," Camille snapped. "Return my license so I can be on my way." "I don't think so," Cutler said, his voice dropping to a menacing gravel. "Step out of the vehicle, Counselor. I have probable cause to conduct a search of this car." "You have absolutely no probable cause, Sergeant," Camille fired back, her lawyer instincts flaring. "I do not consent to any search of my vehicle, my person or my property. I don't need your permission, Cutler barked, his demeanor instantly shifting to aggressive hostility. He yanked the door handle, pulling it open. Step out of the car now, or I will pull you out for resisting. Officer Jenkins had already moved to the passenger side, his hand resting conspicuously on his holster. Outnumbered and isolated, Camille had no choice. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the freezing rain. Cutler grabbed her roughly by the arm, spinning her around and slamming her chest against the side of her own car. "Hands on the roof!" he shouted. "You are making a massive mistake, Cutler," Camille gasped as the cold metal bit through her coat. "Shut up," he hissed in her ear. He patted her down aggressively, then turned to Jenkins. "Watch her, I'm tossing the car." For 20 agonizing minutes, Camille stood in the freezing rain while Cutler tore her car apart. He threw her legal documents onto the wet floorboards, ripped open the center console, and finally moved to the trunk. He popped the trunk lid, blocking Camille's view with his broad back. He reached into his heavy tactical jacket, pulling out the black velvet bag he had hidden there all evening. With a practiced sleight of hand, he dropped it next to the spare tire, then loudly announced, "Well, what do we have here?" Cutler turned around, holding the velvet bag up in the harsh glare of the police cruiser's headlights. He opened it, pulling out a thick stack of $100 bills bound in rubber bands and the glittering diamond watch. "Looks like we found the proceeds from the Montgomery home invasion," Cutler sneered, walking toward her. "You know, the one where the homeowner was beaten half to death? I always wondered how you afforded those fancy suits, Dawson. Didn't realize you were holding stolen property for your thug clients." "I have never seen that bag in my life," Camille said, her voice trembling, a reaction Cutler mistook for sheer terror. "You planted that. You put that in my trunk. Tell it to the judge." Cutler laughed harshly. He grabbed her wrists, pulling them painfully behind her back, and slapped the heavy steel handcuffs on her. "Camille Dawson, you are under arrest for possession of stolen property, conspiracy, and whatever else I decide to write on the report. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." As Jenkins shoved her into the claustrophobic back seat of the cruiser, Cutler stood in the rain, grinning triumphantly. He had done it. He had taken down the untouchable lawyer. Her life was over. But in the back seat of the patrol car, hidden by the shadows and the cage, the look of terror on Camille's face vanished entirely. She let out a slow, steady breath. She turned her head slightly toward the collar of her wool coat, where a microscopic microphone was woven into the fabric. "Did you get all that, David?" she whispered softly. Less than a mile away, parked inside a nondescript commercial garage, the back of a plumbing repair van was glowing with the light of a dozen high-definition monitors. The interior was a state-of-the-art mobile command center. Special Agent David Mercer of the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force pressed a button on his headset. "We got it all, Camille. Audio is crystal clear. Visuals from the dash cam we hacked in his cruiser confirm the manipulation of the trunk. You did perfectly. Just sit tight." Mercer let out a long breath, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across his face. Beside him, 3 other federal agents were rapidly typing on keyboards, locking in timestamps and securing the encrypted data streams coming from Camille's location. The truth was, Camille Dawson hadn't just been investigating Sergeant Wayne Cutler on her own. 6 months ago, she had hit a brick wall in her private investigation. Every time she got close to a witness willing to testify against the corrupt squad, they suddenly retracted their statements, terrified of police retaliation. Realizing that the local system was too compromised to police itself, Camille had taken her files directly to the federal government. She had walked into the local FBI field office and demanded to see the agent in charge of organized crime and corruption. Agent Mercer had taken the meeting, initially skeptical of a defense attorney making wild claims about an entire police precinct. But Camille had brought receipts, bank statements, mapped out patrol routes, and a pattern of asset forfeitures that defied statistical probability. Mercer had opened a covert investigation, codenamed Operation Blind Justice, but taking down a decorated 20-year veteran sergeant required more than circumstantial evidence and hearsay. They needed to catch Cutler in the act of committing a major felony, on tape, with irrefutable physical evidence. When Camille told Mercer that her informants warned her Cutler was planning to frame her, Mercer didn't tell her to go into hiding. Instead, he saw the ultimate opportunity. If Cutler wanted to frame an innocent woman, the FBI was going to give him the rope to hang himself. The velvet bag? The $50,000? The diamond watch? None of it belonged to the crew that robbed the home in the suburbs. The FBI had intercepted that stolen property 2 days prior in a separate, unpublicized raid. Knowing Cutler used a network of informants to procure clean stolen goods for his frame jobs, the FBI had intentionally leaked the items back onto the black market through an undercover asset, specifically directing them into the hands of Cutler's most trusted fence. Cutler thought he was planting untraceable stolen goods. In reality, he had just walked right into a federal trap. Every single $100 bill in that velvet bag had its serial number logged in an FBI database. More importantly, the cash and the watch had been coated in a specialized, invisible ultraviolet dye, a chemical compound that transferred upon contact and could not be washed off for days. The moment Cutler reached into his jacket and grabbed that bag to plant it in Camille's trunk, his hands, his uniform, and the steering wheel of his cruiser became glowing, radioactive evidence of his crime. Inside the mobile command center, Mercer watched the GPS tracker pinging from Cutler's cruiser as it began moving toward the 44th precinct. "All right, listen up," Mercer commanded, addressing the task force. "Cutler is transporting the asset to the precinct. He's going to book her, try to break her in an interrogation room, and likely parade her through the bullpen to make an example out of her. We give him exactly 1 hour to falsify his official arrest report and log the evidence. Once he signs his name to that federal document, the trap snaps shut." Back in the police cruiser, Camille sat in silence, her wrists aching from the tight steel cuffs. Cutler was driving erratically, the siren off but the light still flashing, bragging to Jenkins in the front seat. "I'm telling you, Greg," the look on her face. Cutler laughed, slapping the steering wheel. She thought she was untouchable. Tomorrow morning, the local news is going to have a field day. Prominent civil rights lawyer arrested in connection with brutal home invasion. Albright will fire her before lunch. "You think she'll take a plea?" Jenkins asked, sounding slightly nervous now that the deed was done. "She'll have to," Cutler scoffed. "We've got the stolen goods right out of her trunk. It's my word against a criminal defense attorney caught red-handed. The DA will eat this up." Camille stared at the back of Cutler's thick neck, keeping her face perfectly impassive. Let him talk, she thought. Let him build his own cage. When they arrived at the precinct, Cutler dragged Camille out of the car by her handcuffs. He intentionally paraded her through the front doors, right past the busy front desk and the bullpen full of late-shift officers. The room went dead silent as they saw who it was. Several of the corrupt cops in Cutler's inner circle exchanged knowing, malicious grins. Cutler pushed her roughly onto a wooden bench, bolted to the wall near the booking station. "Process her," he ordered the desk sergeant. "Felony possession of stolen property. I'm going to my office to write up the official incident report and log the evidence into the locker." Camille sat quietly as her fingerprints were taken and her mugshot snapped. She played the part flawlessly, eyes downcast, lips trembling, looking for all the world like a woman whose entire life had just collapsed. In reality, she was counting down the minutes. Upstairs in his private office, Sergeant Wayne Cutler sat at his desk, humming a cheerful tune. He logged into the department's digital reporting system and began typing. He detailed the erratic driving, the smell of marijuana, and the nervous demeanor of the suspect. He wrote a vivid, entirely fictional account of discovering the velvet bag hidden beneath the spare tire. He noted the exact amount of cash and the description of the watch. With a final, self-satisfied smirk, Cutler clicked Submit, officially entering the falsified police report into the state system, a federal offense of perjury and evidence tampering. He printed out the evidence tags, slapped them onto the velvet bag, and walked down the hall to the evidence locker. He signed the logbook, handed the bag to the clerk, and stretched his arms above his head. It was a good night's work. His greatest enemy was locked in a holding cell, his precinct was secure, and his empire was safe. Cutler walked back down the stairs toward the holding cells, wanting to gloat one last time. He wanted to stand outside the bars and watch the powerful Camille Dawson break down and cry. He turned the corner into the booking area, expecting to see her hunched over on the wooden bench. Instead, she was standing perfectly upright. She wasn't crying. She was staring straight at him. And for the first time all night, there was a sharp, dangerous smile on her face. Cutler frowned, his pace slowing. Something was wrong. The desk sergeant who had been processing her was standing against the wall, looking pale and terrified. Before Cutler could ask what was going on, the heavy steel doors of the precinct's main entrance blew open with a deafening crash. A dozen men and women in dark tactical gear poured into the room. They weren't local police. They were moving with precise military efficiency, fanning out across the room and securing every exit. Across their backs, in bold, stark yellow letters, were 3 letters that made the blood freeze in Cutler's veins. FBI. Agent David Mercer walked through the doors last, wearing a sharp suit and a calm, authoritative expression. He walked straight past the bewildered desk sergeant, past the panicked local cops in the bullpen, and stopped directly in front of Sergeant Wayne Cutler. "Wayne Cutler," Mercer said, his voice echoing in the dead, silent precinct. "You're having a very bad night." The silence in the 44th precinct was absolute, thick and suffocating. A dozen federal agents, armed with tactical rifles and carrying lockboxes, stood positioned at every exit and critical junction of the room. The local patrol officers, many of whom were loyal soldiers in Sergeant Wayne Cutler's illicit empire, froze in their tracks. Some raised their hands instinctively. Others stepped away from their desks, eyes darting toward the heavy glass doors that had just been breached. Cutler's face went completely slack. The arrogant smirk that had plastered his features for the last hour dissolved into a mask of pale confusion. He looked at Agent David Mercer, then at the tactical team, and finally, his eyes drifted down to the wooden bench. Camille Dawson wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking right at him, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, absolute victory. "What the hell is this, Mercer?" Cutler demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it back into a booming, authoritative register. He puffed out his chest, stepping toward the federal agent. "You are completely out of your jurisdiction. This is a local precinct, and we are in the middle of processing a felony suspect. You and your team need to step outside before I call the commissioner. You can call whoever you'd like, Wayne, right after I finish reading you your rights," Mercer said, his voice calm, flat, and devoid of any intimidation. He gestured to 2 agents who were already moving toward the back hallway. "Agent Foster, secure the evidence locker. Nobody goes in or out. Agent Willis, unplug the local servers and lock down the digital incident reporting system. We need an airtight chain of custody on the perjury he just committed." Cutler's jaw tightened. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Camille. "Perjury? Are you out of your mind? That woman is a criminal. I just pulled 50 grand in stolen cash and a diamond watch out of the trunk of her car. It's logged in evidence right now." "Actually, Wayne," Camille interrupted, her voice ringing out clearly across the stunned bullpen. "I think you'll find that the property you just booked belongs to the United States Treasury." Cutler whipped his head toward her, his mind struggling to process the impossible shift in power. "Shut your mouth. You're a felon." "Sergeant Cutler," Mercer stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "For the last 6 months, Ms. Dawson has been acting as an undercover asset for the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force. We have a wire on her person. We have audio of your entire traffic stop. We have a direct, real-time feed from the dash cam in your cruiser, which we remotely accessed an hour ago. We watched you open her trunk. We watched you pull a black velvet bag out of your own tactical jacket, and we watched you plant it beneath her spare tire." The color drained completely from Cutler's face. He took a half-step backward, bumping into a desk. You can't prove that. It's a setup. You manipulated the video. The bag was hers." "I figured you might say that," Mercer replied, a predatory smile finally breaking through his stoic demeanor. "Which is why we didn't just use any cash." Mercer reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy-duty, hand-held flashlight with a specialized dark glass lens. He nodded to an agent by the wall. "Hit the lights." The overhead fluorescent bulbs in the precinct snapped off. The room was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the amber glow of the streetlights outside the windows and the computer monitors on the desks. Mercer clicked the button on the flashlight. A brilliant, intense beam of ultraviolet light cut through the dark. He swept the beam slowly across the room, pausing briefly on the floor before raising it directly onto Sergeant Wayne Cutler. The collective gasp from the local officers was audible. Under the black light, Cutler's hands were glowing. A vibrant, radioactive neon green dye coated his palms and the pads of his fingers. The glowing chemical compound was smeared across the front of his tactical jacket where he had reached into his pocket. It was smeared on the handle of his duty belt. "Thief detection powder, Sergeant," Mercer said, his voice echoing in the dark. "An invisible, military-grade ultraviolet compound. We coated the velvet bag, the watch, and every single $100 bill with it before we leaked it to your fence, Jimmy the Snake Rossi, 2 days ago. It transfers upon contact. It takes industrial solvent and 3 days of scrubbing to get it off human skin." Mercer slowly panned the UV light over to the wooden bench. It illuminated Camille Dawson. Her black wool coat, her hands, her face, they were completely clean. Not a single speck of glowing green. "As you can see," Mercer continued, the finality of the trap snapping shut, echoing in his tone. "Ms. Dawson never touched the bag. The only person in this room glowing like a neon sign is the man who planted it." Suddenly, a frantic voice shouted from the back of the room. Officer Greg Jenkins, who had been hiding near the break room, threw his hands in the air and rushed forward. "He made me do it!" Jenkins screamed, his voice pitching high with panic. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't want to plant it. Cutler had the bag. He's been extorting the neighborhood for years. I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. Just don't lock me up." Cutler spun around, staring at his loyal protégé with absolute hatred. "You cowardly piece of garbage!" Cutler lunged toward Jenkins, his fists raised, but he never made it a single step. 3 FBI agents tackled Cutler to the linoleum floor, driving their knees into his spine. The heavy thud of the corrupt sergeant hitting the ground signaled the absolute collapse of his 20-year reign of terror. "Wayne Cutler," Mercer boomed over the struggle, "you are under arrest for Title 18 U.S.C., Section 2442. Deprivation of rights, under color of law, conspiracy to commit federal perjury, evidence tampering, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent, though God knows you've already said enough on tape to bury yourself." As the agents hauled a furious, screaming Cutler to his feet, pulling his glowing, neon-stained hands behind his back to apply the heavy steel handcuffs, Mercer walked over to the wooden bench. He pulled a small key from his pocket and inserted it into the cuffs binding Camille's wrists. With a sharp click, the metal bands fell away. Camille stood up, rubbing her wrists, her posture immaculate, her dignity completely intact. Cutler, out of breath and realizing his entire life was over, locked eyes with Camille one last time as he was dragged toward the door. "You think you won?" Cutler spat, venom lacing every word. "You think you can take down the whole system? I'm just one guy, Dawson. You have no idea what you've stirred up." Camille adjusted the collar of her coat, stepping right up to the disgraced cop. She looked him up and down, her expression one of absolute pity. "I didn't take down the system, Wayne," she said softly, but with enough edge to cut glass. "I just took out the trash. Enjoy federal prison. I hear they love dirty cops in maximum security." By 6 a.m. the following morning, the city was awake, and it was burning with the news. Sergeant Wayne Cutler had envisioned a media circus, tearing down Camille Dawson's reputation. Instead, the local news channels were locked onto a live aerial feed of the 44th Precinct. Federal mobile command units blocked the streets. Dozens of FBI agents were carrying cardboard boxes full of physical files, hard drives, and seized evidence out the front doors. The headline flashing across the bottom of every television screen in the city read, "Massive FBI raid on 44th Precinct. Veteran sergeant arrested in extortion squad sting." Camille Dawson sat in the expansive conference room of Albright and Associates, a steaming cup of black coffee in her hands. Across the mahogany table sat Stephen Albright, the firm's senior partner, staring at a television screen in absolute, stunned silence. "You wore a wire," Stephen said slowly, turning his gaze back to Camille. "For 6 months, you've been wearing a wire into the local precincts, cross-examining hostile police witnesses, and meeting with suspected corrupt officials. Camille, my God, the liability, the danger." "The danger was doing nothing, Stephen," Camille replied, taking a calm sip of her coffee. "Cutler was escalating. If I hadn't pushed him into a corner, he would have continued ruining innocent lives. My clients were going to jail because this man wanted a bigger boat and a second home in Florida. I did what a defense attorney is sworn to do. I sought justice." Stephen let out a long, heavy exhale, then a slow smile crept across his weathered face. "The mayor's office has called 3 times. The district attorney is in full panic mode. Every single conviction Wayne Cutler secured over the last decade is now subject to review. You didn't just win a case, Camille. You detonated a bomb under the criminal justice system in this city, across town, inside a bleak, windowless interrogation room at the Federal Detention Center. That bomb was still exploding. Wayne Cutler sat in an orange jumpsuit, the glowing UV dye still deeply embedded in the pores of his hands and underneath his fingernails. Without his badge, without his gun, and without his tactical gear, he looked remarkably small. The aura of invincibility had evaporated, leaving only a desperate, cornered man. Agent David Mercer sat across from him, a thick manila folder resting on the steel table between them. 25 years, Wayne, Mercer said, casually flipping open the folder. That's the conservative estimate. The civil rights violations alone carry a 10-year mandatory minimum. Add on the racketeering, the conspiracy, and the fact that Greg Jenkins spent the last 8 hours singing like a choir boy about every stash house you ever robbed. You are going to die in a federal penitentiary. Cutler swallowed hard, his throat dry. His eyes darted around the room. He knew how the game was played. He had played it from the other side of the table for decades. "I want a deal," Cutler rasped. "You don't have anything to trade," Mercer countered smoothly. "We have the physical evidence, the wiretaps, and a cooperating witness. I don't need a confession from you. You need me." Cutler leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the walls were listening. You think a sergeant runs a multi-million-dollar extortion ring in this city without kicking up? You think Internal Affairs just happened to lose the 20 different complaints filed against me over the years by sheer incompetence? Mercer paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't speak, letting the silence draw Cutler out. I didn't build this alone, Cutler said, desperation leaking into his tone. I kick 20% of every seizure up the ladder, and I know who kills the IA investigations before they ever reach a judge. I can give you Deputy Chief Arthur Pendleton. I can give you his offshore accounts. I can give you the names of the judges he owns. Mercer closed the folder slowly. Pendleton was the second highest-ranking officer in the city. If Cutler wasn't bluffing, the corruption went straight into the stratosphere. We don't offer immunity, Wayne, Mercer said coldly. But if you wear a wire into a meeting with Pendleton and deliver him on a silver platter, I will ask the U.S. Attorney to recommend a reduced sentence. That's the only lifeline you get. Take it, or I walk out that door, right how. Cutler stared at his glowing, neon-green hands. I'll take it. But even as Cutler was frantically trying to save his own skin, his hidden contingency plan was already in motion. Cutler hadn't trusted Jenkins entirely. He knew the young cop was weak. Cutler's true insurance policy was a ruthless, off-the-books vice detective named Victor Russo. Russo wasn't at the precinct during the raid. He operated in the shadows, handling Cutler's wet work and witness intimidation. When Russo saw the news of Cutler's arrest, he knew the FBI would be coming for the ledger hidden in Cutler's suburban home, a ledger that contained Russo's name tied to a dozen illicit payouts. Russo also knew that Camille Dawson was the linchpin of the federal case. Without her testimony regarding the initial frame-up, Cutler's defense attorney might be able to cast doubt on the wiretaps, claiming entrapment. Russo decided to sever the head of the snake. He needed to silence Camille Dawson immediately before she could testify before a federal grand jury. That evening, Camille was dropped off at her suburban home. To the outside world, she appeared vulnerable. But Agent Mercer wasn't an amateur. He had stationed an unmarked FBI vehicle down the street and a plainclothes agent inside her house. However, Victor Russo was a professional stalker. He knew police surveillance tactics inside and out. He parked 3 blocks away, bypassed the street cameras, and approached Camille's property through the dense, wooded ravine behind her backyard. As Camille stood in her kitchen, pouring a glass of water and staring out into the dark backyard, the motion sensor lights on her patio suddenly clicked off. Someone had unscrewed the bulbs. The glass sliding door rattled softly. Russo, dressed entirely in black, picked the lock on the back door with practiced ease and slipped into the kitchen. He drew a suppressed automatic pistol from his waistband, creeping silently toward the hallway where a light was on. You're a very hard woman to intimidate, Miss Dawson. Russo's gravelly voice broke the silence as he stepped into the living room, leveling his weapon. Camille was sitting on her velvet sofa, holding her glass of water. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, completely unbothered. Detective Victor Russo, I presume? Camille said, taking a sip of water. I was wondering when you'd show up. Wayne always said you were his attack dog. Russo frowned, stepping closer, keeping the gun aimed at her chest. You're too calm for someone about to commit suicide out of guilt for framing a decorated police sergeant. I'm calm, Victor, because you clearly haven't been paying attention to the news today, Camille replied, setting her glass down on the coffee table. Do you really think the FBI would dismantle a corrupt precinct, arrest a kingpin sergeant, and just leave their star witness sitting alone in the suburbs with no backup? Russo's eyes went wide. He spun around toward the kitchen. Drop the weapon. Federal agents, drop it now. 4 FBI tactical agents, who had been waiting silently in the darkened dining room and the upstairs hallway, stepped out of the shadows. 4 red laser sights painted Rousseau's chest. Rousseau froze, his finger hovering over the trigger of his suppressed pistol. He looked back at Camille, realizing with absolute horror that he hadn't ambushed her. She had used herself as bait. Again. "Wayne gave you up, Victor," Camille said softly, leaning back into her sofa. "He's in a federal interrogation room right now, trading your name for a lighter sentence. You walked right into a trap." Rousseau's shoulders slumped. The heavy pistol fell from his hand, clattering against the hardwood floor. As the agent swarmed Rousseau, throwing him against the wall and slapping the cuffs on him, Agent Mercer walked out of the kitchen, holstering his own weapon. He looked at Camille, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know, Counselor," Mercer said, a grudging respect in his voice. "I've worked with a lot of undercover assets in my career, but you are, without a doubt, the most dangerous bait I have ever seen." Camille smiled, watching Rousseau get dragged out of her front door. "I'm a defense attorney, David. I make a living outsmarting bullies. These guys just wear badges." 2 days after the botched assassination attempt on Camille Dawson, the city was practically holding its breath. The local media had entered a feeding frenzy, running 24-hour coverage on the 44th precinct. Dozens of convictions were already being overturned, and the district attorney's office was hemorrhaging credibility. But while the public thought the climax of the scandal had already been reached, Agent David Mercer and his task force were quietly preparing for the killing blow. Wayne Cutler was released from federal holding under the cover of darkness. He wasn't free. He was a walking ghost, entirely owned by the United States government. Beneath his casual civilian clothes, a microscopic transmitter was taped tightly to his sternum. 2 distinct GPS trackers were woven into the lining of his leather jacket and the heel of his boot. Cutler was pale, sweating profusely despite the chilly autumn air, and trembling with a cocktail of rage and sheer terror. His target was Deputy Chief Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a titan in the city's political and law enforcement circles. A 30-year veteran with a law degree from Georgetown and a spotless public record, he was widely considered the heir apparent for the commissioner's seat. He was elegant, soft-spoken, and brutally efficient at covering his tracks. Pendleton didn't get his hands dirty kicking down doors or planting evidence. He dealt in the currency of favors, buried internal affairs reports, and offshore accounts. Cutler had arranged the emergency meeting using a pre-established burner phone protocol, signaling a code red. Pendleton had chosen the location, the private, members-only cigar lounge at the Wellington Athletic Club, a bastion of old money and power located on the affluent north side of the city. At 9:00 p.m., Cutler walked into the dimly lit, mahogany-paneled lounge. The air was thick with the smell of aged leather and expensive tobacco. Pendleton sat in a high-backed leather chair in the far corner, a glass of single malt scotch resting on the table beside him. He looked up as Cutler approached, his expression a mask of icy displeasure. "You have exactly 2 minutes, Wayne, before I call the front desk and have you removed for trespassing," Pendleton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your face is plastered across every television screen in this state. Coming here is a monumental liability." "I didn't have a choice, Arthur," Cutler stammered, sinking into the chair opposite the deputy chief. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, playing the part of a desperate, broken man flawlessly, mostly because he actually was. "The feds froze my assets. They have me on tape. They arrested Rousseau last night. He tried to take out the lawyer, Dawson, and walked right into an FBI ambush." Pendleton's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The pristine, composed veneer cracked just a fraction. "Rousseau is a fool, and you, Wayne, are an arrogant liability. You were told to manage your precinct, not to start a personal vendetta against a high-profile civil rights attorney. Framing Camille Dawson? A woman who is already scrutinizing your every move. It was career suicide. She was getting too close, Cutler hissed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. She was asking about the asset forfeiture funds. She was pulling records on the Montgomery home invasion. I had to shut her down. But you have to help me, Arthur. You promised protection. That was the deal. I kick 20% up to you, and you keep internal affairs off my back. Pendleton took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. He looked around the empty room, secure in the knowledge that the club required all staff to surrender their phones and prohibited recording devices. He had no idea the FBI was currently listening to his every word from a tactical van parked 3 blocks away. I protected you from local inquiries, Wayne. I buried 7 excessive force complaints and 3 separate IA audits for your squad, Pendleton stated coldly. But you brought the federal government to my doorstep. There is no burying the FBI. You own Judge Philip Wallace, Cutler pressed, his voice rising in manufactured panic. You told me yourself. You said Wallace owes you for making that DUI of his disappear 5 years ago. Have my case assigned to his docket. He can suppress the wiretap evidence. He can claim the FBI's warrant was unconstitutional. Do not raise your voice to me, Pendleton snapped, the venom finally pouring out. Wallace is a local superior court judge. You are facing a federal indictment. My influence with Wallace only covers state-level problems, which you would know if you weren't panicking like a cornered animal. Pendleton sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Here is what is going to happen, Wayne. You are going to plead guilty. You are going to take the 25 years. While you are inside, your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the ones I helped you set up through the Shell Corporation, Apex Holdings, will continue to accrue interest. I will ensure your family is taken care of. But if you utter my name to David Mercer or anyone else in that task force, Pendleton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly, gravelly register. I will have you killed before you even make it to the federal penitentiary. I control the transport routes. I control the guards at the county holding facility. You work for me, Wayne, and right now, your job is to fall on your sword. In the tactical van, Agent Mercer pulled off his headset. He looked at the senior prosecutor standing beside him. He just admitted to burying official audits, controlling a state judge, managing illicit offshore accounts, and threatening to murder a federal witness, Mercer said, a grim smile spreading across his face. Let's go. Back in the lounge, Cutler let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Pendleton, the fear in his eyes replaced by a hollow, bitter resignation. I'm not falling on my sword for you, Arthur, Cutler whispered. Pendleton frowned. What did you say? Before Pendleton could process the sudden shift in Cutler's demeanor, the heavy oak doors of the cigar lounge were kicked open. Federal agents, nobody move. The tactical team swarmed the room in seconds. Agent Mercer strode in, his badge held high, his eyes locked onto the deputy chief. Arthur Pendleton didn't run. He didn't shout. He slowly placed his glass of scotch on the table and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from his tailored suit jacket. He looked at Cutler, noticing the slight bulge beneath the sergeant's shirt for the first time. A wire, Pendleton said softly, the realization washing over him. You pathetic, cowardly rat. Arthur Pendleton, Mercer announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, and a laundry list of federal corruption charges. Put your hands behind your back. As the cold steel clicked around the wrists of the city's untouchable deputy chief, the final pillar of the corrupt empire crumbled into dust. The fallout was catastrophic and unprecedented. The arrest of Deputy Chief Arthur Pendleton triggered a domino effect that decimated the city's corrupt power structure. Over the next 6 months, the FBI executed over 40 arrest warrants. Entire squads were dismantled. Dozens of corrupt officers, realizing the gig was up, rushed to cut plea deals, exposing a network of extortion, evidence tampering, and bribery that had plagued the city for decades. The local justice system was thrown into chaos, but for the first time in a long time, it was a necessary, cleansing fire. 9 months after that fateful, freezing night on the side of the highway, Camille Dawson walked up the marble steps of the federal courthouse. She was dressed in a sharp, immaculate navy blue suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. The air was warm with the arrival of summer, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. She walked through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom 4B. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, legal scholars, and citizens from the 44th Precinct's neighborhood who had suffered under Wayne Cutler's regime. At the defense table sat Wayne Cutler. He looked like a shell of the man he once was. His hair had thinned, his broad shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a vacant, defeated stare. Beside him sat Arthur Pendleton, looking equally diminished in his prison-issued uniform. The presiding federal judge, the Honorable Evelyn Davis, slammed her gavel, bringing the murmur of the crowded room to an abrupt halt. "Before I hand down sentencing in this matter," Judge Davis announced, her voice echoing with absolute authority, "the court recognizes the victim in the initial conspiracy, Ms. Camille Dawson, who wishes to read a victim impact statement into the record." Camille stood up from the prosecutor's table. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. She walked to the center podium, adjusted the microphone, and turned her gaze directly onto Wayne Cutler and Arthur Pendleton. "For years," Camille began, her voice steady and echoing with a quiet, undeniable power. "Men sitting at that table believed that the law was a weapon they owned. They believed that a badge was a shield against accountability, and that the people of this city were nothing more than prey to be exploited. They built an empire on fear, intimidation, and the arrogant belief that they were untouchable." Cutler lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. Pendleton stared straight ahead, his jaw locked. "When Sergeant Cutler pulled me over on that highway," Camille continued, "he didn't just try to destroy my life. He tried to send a message to every citizen in this city that if you stand up to corruption, you will be crushed. He believed that the truth could be manufactured with a velvet bag and planted evidence." She paused, letting the silence fill the massive courtroom. "But they forgot one fundamental truth," Camille said, her voice rising, filling with conviction. "The truth is not a fragile thing. It is not easily buried in evidence lockers or hidden in offshore bank accounts. And justice, true justice, is not dispensed by the powerful to the powerless. It is demanded by the people. Wayne Cutler and Arthur Pendleton didn't break the system. They exposed its flaws, and in doing so, they have given us the opportunity to rebuild it." Camille stepped back from the podium. "I ask this court to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law, not out of vengeance, but as a promise to the people of this city that no one, no matter how many stars they wear on their collar, is above the law." A heavy silence lingered in the courtroom before Judge Davis nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Dawson," Judge Davis said. She looked down at the defendants. "Wayne Cutler, Arthur Pendleton, you were sworn to protect the public. Instead, you acted as a cancer upon this city. Your actions have eroded the public's trust in law enforcement, a wound that will take a generation to heal." Judge Davis adjusted her glasses. "Wayne Cutler, on the charges of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy, you are hereby sentenced to 32 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Arthur Pendleton, on the charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and corruption, you are sentenced to 45 years in federal prison." The strike of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. The gallery erupted. Tears of relief flowed from the families of those who had been falsely imprisoned by Cutler's squad. Reporters scrambled for the doors to broadcast the verdict. As the federal marshals pulled Cutler and Pendleton to their feet and led them away in chains, Cutler looked back one last time. Camille wasn't looking at him. She was already packing her briefcase, her focus entirely on the future. An hour later, Camille stood on the steps of the courthouse, the warm summer sun on her face. Agent David Mercer walked up beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Not a bad day's work, Counselor," Mercer said with a slight smile. "Word on the street is Albright & Associates is making you a named partner next week. Dawson, Albright & Associates has a nice ring to it." "It does," Camille smiled, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "But I told Stephen I'm only accepting if I get to open a dedicated civil rights litigation division. There's a lot of messes out there left to clean up." Mercer chuckled, looking out over the bustling city. "Well, if you ever get tired of civil suits, the task force could always use a good undercover agent." Camille laughed, a genuine bright sound that carried over the noise of the traffic. "I think I'll stick to the courtroom, David. The hours are better, and I don't have to wear a wire." She shook his hand, a deep, mutual respect passing between them, and began walking down the steps, disappearing into the crowded, vibrant city. Camille Dawson had walked into the darkness and survived, a brilliant, unyielding force of nature. She had proven that while corruption may hide in the shadows, it only takes one spark of truth to burn the whole thing down. Are you shocked by the insane lengths corrupt cops will go to protect their power? The truth really is stranger, and more dangerous, than fiction. If Camille Dawson's incredible bravery and this unbelievable real-life FBI takedown kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who loves a mind-blowing plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the most intense, jaw-dropping stories of justice, betrayal, and survival every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Camille's shoes?